Hello, my name's Judy Smith, and I want to welcome you all here tonight to the Advance Care Directives. Advance Care Directives are a matter of love, rights and self-determination. And I've been a long-time member of Health Consumers Alliance, probably more time than they care to even think about, and an advocate for people to have a good death. So a good life deserves a good death. I believe that Advance Care Directives are an important step in the process of achieving a good death. And if you want to know, yes, I've got one, and so's my husband. He wouldn't dare not. So tonight I'd like to acknowledge the partners we've got with us here tonight. We've got Health Consumers Alliance. We'd like to thank our partners, Adelaide Primary Healthcare Network, SA Health, and Chris Moore in particular for assisting us with pulling this together, and for our speakers and our panellists. I'd like to acknowledge the new chair of HCA, Julia Overton, who's here tonight. You've got to stand up now. That's one of the rules. CE, sorry. As well as the chair of the board, Deborah Kay. Deborah, where are you hiding? Up there in the corner. And other board members that are here tonight. And I know Jane's here. I'm not sure if I've seen Alan yet, and Tina Wakeland. So welcome, everyone. We'd like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge that the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their culture and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. All right, now I get to introduce the important people. I'd like to introduce you all to our keynote speaker, Mr. Ian Henschke. Ian is an Advanced Care Planning Ambassador and the National Seniors Australia Chief Advocate. Raising the profile of older people, he is also an award-winning broadcaster. Emerging from a background in teaching, Ian's substantive journalism career includes roles at Channel 9, Channel 7 and the ABC TV, where he reported and produced for more than 25 years on programs including Four Corners, Landline and the 7:30 Report. Ian was awarded the Centenary of Federation Medal for services to the Australian Society through broadcasting. In addition to his full-time role as Chief Advocate for National Seniors, he continues to write a regular column for the Advertiser's SA Weekend magazine. Please welcome Mr. Ian Henschke.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I've sort of been thrust into this role. You know, some people have ambassadorial roles. You know, they seek them. I've been thrust into this one, unfortunately, because of the death of my brother last year. And I'm still in shock, and I may get a bit upset when I tell the story, because the other day I went to Melbourne and Advance Care Planning Australia did a video with myself and a woman who wrote this book called Kelly Curtin, and that's available on the website now. It's on YouTube or whatever. I'm sure we can provide the actual details of it by the time we get to the panel, but it's three people telling their stories about what happened in their lives and why it was important to have an Advance Care Directive. In Kelly's case, and I urge you to read this book, it's a beautifully written book. It's called, you know, What Will I Wear to Your Funeral? And it's about the relationship she had with her mother. And it's a very interesting story because her father died when she was 22, just suddenly dropped dead. So the family was used to death, but in the sudden form. But she said they never were worried about talking about death. It wasn't a taboo subject in her family. And Kelly had her mother get breast cancer not long after her father died. And then the cancer went away, and then it came back 25 years later. So she's now a mum with kids herself and having to deal with the issue of a mother. And her mother said, I don't want cancer treatment. I've been through that. I don't want it. So that's what mum wanted. And she had then had to work out how to explain it to her kids. So I'd highly recommend this book. And you know how some people feel like they're an imposter, they call it imposter syndrome. Well, sometimes I feel a bit like that with this story, because I wrote this story really to come to terms with the fact that Richard had died. And in our family, we had two deaths, one on top of the other. And in fact, I've just met someone here who nursed my sister-in-law, and I never had a sister, so I treat her as my sister. So we lost effectively my brother and my sister in the space of 2 months of each other. And I'm lucky, I suppose, in the sense that I come from a family where we have two brothers in the family who are doctors. Mum had 5 children, 5 boys, didn't have a girl, so that's why the loss of my sister-in-law was so great as well. She got a glioblastoma and died over a 2-year period, and that happened just before Christmas last year, just after my brother and his wife celebrated their 49th wedding anniversary. So we stood around with a bottle of Bleasdale sparkling Shiraz and toasted them, and all she could do was just squeeze a hand, and it was very, very powerful to see 2 people so much in love, but their lives were just being parted. In the same way with Richard, Richard was born in 1943, and Mum lost the first child that she had. Mum met my dad when she was 16, she married when she was 22, she had a child the year after when she was 23. And that was in 1942, and that little boy died at the end of that year. And then she had another child, Richard, and Richard, for some reason, we don't know what went wrong, but there were no antibiotics during the Second World War, so we live in a very different time now. So little Bill got up, walked his first steps, and they took a photograph of him, and he was dead by the following morning. So Mum had to deal with that. And then Richard came along, and Richard was just so loved by Mum that she never quite saw that he had what would be today termed a learning disability. So we don't know what happened, we don't know why, but anyway, Richie was a mixed bag. He could remember every detail of, you know, every goal that had been kicked in a Crows game, and he could tell you that Mr. Alexander had a Morris Oxford with wood panelling in its number plate. If you mentioned Mr. Alexander 40 years later. So, and yet at the same time, he was functionally illiterate. Yeah, anyway, Richie was a wonderful brother. So I'd just like to read this to you because it's the only way I can probably get through this, because it feels like I'm at a funeral. You know, I'm sad to say that, but it does. When you talk about death and you're up here with this, it feels a bit like that. But look, my oldest brother died last month. It began with a phone call. Richard's in hospital again, but he's only just got out. I couldn't believe it. Richie was struggling to breathe. He was sent to the new Royal Adelaide. I spent the next week waiting for the inevitable. Traumatic events etch into our brains, I suppose, so we can learn from them. I can see the entrance of the new Royal Adelaide. 2 sets of giant glass doors in between a hand sanitizer. I put my hands under it, it whirs and squirts out some germ-killing gel to make me feel safe enough to head inside. Most visitors ignore the process and just walk by. At the end of the futuristic foyer, a woman is playing a grand piano. It suddenly seems like I'm inside some flash hotel. The notes are mixed with chatter, as jumbled as my feelings. I head down another vast corridor to the second set of lifts. Coming towards me is a girl wearing an AC/DC Highway to Hell t-shirt, pushing a morbidly obese 50-something man who's bearded, tattooed, wearing a football jumper in a wheelchair, and one leg is a wrapped stump. His foot is missing. I think, diabetes? Then I think, is it smoking related? What about Richie's smoking related illness? Will he see another summer? He gave up smoking 20 years ago, but the damage apparently is done. He used to live with Mum. We moved in after Mum died, but his lungs got worse. The phone calls in winter to the paramedics meant he was having to be moved to a nursing home. He went in when he was 64. The average age of entering a nursing home in Australia is 84. Half the residents in nursing homes have some form of dementia. The annual mortality rate is around 30%. Richie beat the odds. He lasted 10 years in aged care. He was born in 1943 with a learning disability. Mum had no daughters. The last 3 sons were born in 45, 49 and 55. She called me the baby. The baby boom began in 1946 and there are now 5.5 million baby boomers in Australia. My mind's racing. As I enter Richard's room, I know something's wrong. He looks pale. He's struggling to smile. He always smiles. "How are you?" I ask. "Not too bad," says Richie. We planned to go to the Royal Adelaide show before all this. I said, I plan to go to the show with the Richie, not the Royal Adelaide Hospital. I wanted to go to the Royal Adelaide show, and here's a laugh. He has end-stage COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, I've learnt it stands for. I'm sure Richard hated smoking, but he got a job as a storeman in an era when everyone stopped for morning and afternoon smoko, and he had to join in if he wanted to be one of the blokes. Well, now it's done him in. Richie smoked menthol because it was easier to come up to cool. Willie the Penguin told him on the pack, and even when a cold has got you wheezing, the cool taste is pleasing. For the past 10 winters, Richard had colds and wheezed. This last time was the worst. He started calling, "Help me, help me, help me." He was put on morphine and tranquilizers. I fed him a bowl of soup. It was the last meal he ever had. He then lost the ability to swallow. Richard had made an Advance Care Directive, and so a palliative care specialist was called in. Richard had written that he was not to be intubated or any other extraordinary measures taken. Richard hadn't written these words, but he'd agreed to them. My brothers, who are both doctors, had worked out the words. So Richard lay there in his hospital bed, his brothers at his side, and there was no pain, only the pain in our hearts. 1 in 5 Australians has an Advance Care Directive. Because Richard had one, he didn't spend his last days in intensive care, being given costly and futile treatment. According to an article I read just after Richard died, we spend, or rather waste, $153 million a year on end-of-life treatments that provide no benefit. The new medically assisted dying law in Victoria will only affect a tiny fraction of people. People haven't won the general right to choose when they end their life, but we all have the right to say how we want our life to end. So have the end-of-life discussion with your family and your GP. Write down what you want. 3/4 of us say we want to die at home, and yet only 1 in 7 of us will. And talking of wills, make sure you've got one of those as well. Almost half of Australians don't have a will. The number of baby boomers arriving in life's departure lounge means that the numbers of deaths in Australia is going to double in the next 25 years. So if you want to die in your own home, if you want to die surrounded by your family, if you want to die in a hospital and not an intensive care ward, in an ordinary ward, you don't want to be surrounded by machines going beep, then you can do something about it. If you do, you'll save your family an awful lot of worries, and you'll also help save the health system billions of dollars. I learned that from my brother, so thank you, Richie. So that's what I wrote in the paper last year, and since then I got asked to be an ambassador for advanced care planning, but I still find it very hard to read. So what I want to say is that because Richard did this, it brought us together as a family. It didn't sort of pull us apart. So the gift that he gave us was that if you do this, then you don't sit around arguing with your siblings in hospital. You know, Richie would have wanted this or he would have wanted that. And that's what I was trying to do in the hospital. You know, I kept on sort of feeling myself, you know, oh, can't we get him into the, can't we get him some, you know, and then my brother saying, no, Richie had decided. And I know they'd had that discussion, but your immediate reaction for your loved one is you want them, everything you could possibly throw at them. But it's not. Richie's gone. And it just doesn't seem the same anymore. You know, it won't bring him back, but what he's done is he's given us something that we can think about. So that's my little story from Richie to you, you know. And if he was here now, he'd say, oh, it's pretty simple. You just get someone, they help you, you do it, you sign it, that's it. You know, Richie was just, you know, everything was all pretty simple with Richie. And some people used to say he was simple, but you know what? Sometimes the simplest things are the best. No, I don't want to be in one of those hooked up to things and no, I don't want to, no. No, if that's what it's like, I don't want that. I don't want that. I could almost hear him. You know, I don't want that. Watched too many TV shows and seen people hooked up to machines. You know, he knew what life was. Life was being able to get around, be upright, be breathing, being able to have a joke, being able to get on with people. It wasn't lying in some vegetative state being fed by a tube, and he knew that. He may not have had a high IQ, but he had a hell of a high EQ. You know, we went through all this, and then literally you know, the next month we had the same thing happening again with my sister-in-law, and she was a nurse, and she was married to my brother when they were at the old Queen Vic. You know, she was Miss West Coast, South Australia, you know, beautiful woman. And to see her, you know, she was in one of those Miss South Australia quests, and my brother just, you know, fell in love with her, and he was a young doctor. It was, you know, remember those TV series, Young Doctors? It was like that. She made him a cup of tea, and, you know, and he just, you know, thought that's the best person. Very strange in our family too. I'll tell you this because they've all got, I married Lillian, my brother married Lorena, and my other brother married Leonie, and my mother's name was Eileen. So send that off to Freud to work that out. We obviously like the L word ladies, you know. But anyway, Lorena was the most beautiful person, and one of the people here today was involved in her end-of-life care, and she did the same thing. She knew exactly what she wanted. She knew she wanted to die at home. She wanted to be surrounded by her family, you know. So it was all made clear what she wanted. And it's the same thing in this book by Kelly. And I suppose we go rambling through our lives thinking we're going to go on forever and everything's going to be perfect. And it's not. In our family, in this last, you know, that's in just 6 months, we've had 2 major losses. You know, I don't know where the next one will be, but I know that it's around the corner somewhere. You know that the Grim Reaper hides around the place. It could have been me on the weekend. I've got a black eye, see that there? And that's not from the wife. Although she feels like giving me one every now and again, but that was being down at Port Elliot, and I was just trying to do something stupid. You've got all these people that swim across the bay, you know, and they swim across the bay, and I thought, oh, well, I'll try and do that. And so I swim across the bay. I got to the far end of Horseshoe Bay. I turned around to come in, and as I came in, you know, I'm a bit tired, and then I sort of get out of the water. I've swum about 500 metres or whatever. So I get out of the water and I look around and I see this big wave coming. I think, oh yeah, what you got to do? You got to dive through the wave, you know. So I dived into the wave, and it picked me up, twisted me around like a tea towel, tipped me over, and slammed me down into the sand and smacked there. And I got grazed on my back. And I went over to the Surf Lifesaving Club, and the fellow in the Surf Lifesaving Club said, I said to him, oh, I just want to tell you what happened to me over there. He said, oh yeah, that's where the bloke broke his T2 the other weekend, Easter weekend. Port Elliot, you know. So, I mean, it could have been like that then. And then what if I'd been in a situation like that, and my kids, and I've got a 12 and a 14-year-old. Can you imagine the 2 of them? You know, a hormonal teenager screaming and, you know, saying, Dad would want to be, you know, no, I don't care. I want him kept alive, you know, because she feels so guilty because she's been so horrible to me. You know, I can imagine the 2 of them, you know, having a squabble in the hospital. Well, if I've written down what I want, then Mum can just say, look, darling, that's what he said. That's what he wanted. We talked about it. Remember, we talked about it. So, you know, it can be as simple as, you know, me getting on the push bike and riding home and getting hit by a bus tonight. We just don't know when it's going to happen. And the beautiful thing about both Lorena and Richie knew, because he had COPD, that was going to be the end stage. Lorena had a glioblastoma, so she knew what was happening, so they were given time. This lady, Kelly Curtin's mother, knew as well. But a lot of us don't know, but the message I'm just saying is, in my new, you know, ambassadorial role that's been thrust upon me is, do your homework. You know, it's not much. It's what we used to be told to do. Do your homework. Go home, do your homework. If you haven't done it, do it. Talk to your friends about it, get them to do it. Talk to your family about it, get them to do it. And as the late John Clark, you know, who suddenly dropped dead, would say, I'll get out of your way now. All right? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. Really appreciate that you've shared in your personal experience about your brother's death and how he was able to have his rights upheld and achieve a good death through the use of his Advance Care Directive. Can we all please thank Ian? Thank you very much. And Ian's so right, none of us knows what tomorrow brings. So, you know, that's the only thing that we're sure about. None of us can see what's happening tomorrow. So we do have to be, like the Boy Scouts or Girl Guides, be prepared. So I'd now like to introduce Chris Moy, Dr. Chris Moy. Dr. Chris Moy is a GP working in Adelaide with a long-standing involvement in the areas of aged care, end-of-life decision-making, palliative care and digital health at both a state and national level. He's an Advance Care Planning Week ambassador, a former member of the expert advisory group of the SA Advanced Care Directives Review and the SA End of Life Program Working Group, which developed the Resuscitation Plan 7 pathway currently being implemented across GP Partners' palliative care shared care model. He's current chair of its Operation Consultative Committee, and he's a member of the SA End of Life Care Strategy Program Board. Chris has been involved over many years in the development of the My Health Record, on which advanced care planning documents can now be uploaded by individuals. He's currently a member of the My Health Record Expansion Program Steering Group. There's a lot of big words in here. And of the Australian Digital Health Agency. He's chair of the Adelaide Primary Health Network, Central Adelaide Clinical Council, and has a GP clinical editor for the South Australian Health Pathways and chair of the Ethics and Medico-Legal Committee of the Australian Medical Association. And in his spare time, yeah, goodness, please welcome Dr. Chris Moy.
Thank you very much, Judy. Look, my talk's going to be a little bit more practical, and you might notice some frustration and grumpiness in that's my tendency, so I apologise if I come across that way. So the talk is about advanced care planning and advanced care directives at end of life, how they should work. I'm going to talk about how they should work in operation. Now, this is not the story that how they always work, because stories don't always go to plan. But look, what we're going to talk today is about understanding that advanced care directives, I want to emphasise this, that advanced care directives are a matter of love, rights and self-determination. Second thing is understand what advanced care planning and advanced care directives and the supporting legislation are in South Australia. Understand why we need them and how advanced care planning and advanced care directives, along with some other bits, can come together to increase your chance of dying in a manner in line with your wishes, but also in comfort and dignity. Now, the first question, what is advanced care planning? So I'm going to go through some definitions first. So advanced care planning is a process. It's actually a doing thing. It's a process involving you, the people that are going to make decisions for you, family, carers, and your healthcare team, quite often your GP or other doctors. And it's an ongoing discussion or talk in which the plan is to answer the questions, define goals and aspirations, really get everyone on the same page to work as a team, and to improve certainty, because particularly in end-of-life situations, people are facing very scary situations with a lot of uncertainty, and having that extra certainty about what's going to happen and who's going to do what is really important. The thing is that a lot of people are going to have these discussions, but if they're just discussions, that's half the job, because if they're not documented, we have a problem. Because if they're not documented and they're not available when they're required for decisions by healthcare providers or doctors, well, they might as well not be there sometimes. Okay, so that's why we need documentation of these things. So I'm actually going to go through some definitions now. There are 3 types of basic documents, and this is by the National Framework of Advanced Care Directives. The definitions are that there are 3 types of forms. The first type of form is an advanced care plan. An advanced care plan is an informal document. It's a document you can write on a bit of paper, you can tattoo it on your arm, you can write it in blood on the wall. But basically, it's pretty much what you can do. But it's an informal document which ultimately, if it's signed and witnessed, does have some protection under common law. So if you write you don't want something done and it is meant to, then it has some effect. The problem with those documents is there's too many of them. There have been far too many. And you've got to remember at the end where we're the health providers, we have to look at these forms and we don't know what they are sometimes. So this is why I'm going to advertise for the next one, which is Advanced Care Directives. These are legal documents linked to specific sets of laws. And in South Australia, there's a single form now, which is linked to the Advanced Care Directives Act 2013. Now, these advanced care plans and advanced care directives represent the individual's wishes. There is another type of form called a clinical plan, which I'm going to talk to you about a little bit later, just mention it briefly. These are clinical instructions written by the doctor responsible, which is really a synthesis of the individual's wishes, which are going to be useful by health providers at the point of care. You know, when it really gets pointy, if you write something like, I don't want to suffer, it's actually not very useful to somebody in the middle, an emergency officer in the middle of the night. So we need clear instructions, and they really do need to be written by a health provider. So we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so what can you document in an advanced care directive? On an advanced care directive form, a competent adult who's 18 years or older can do one of 2 things. Appoint 1 or more substitute decision makers, and I'm going to call them SDMs now because I have a lot of trouble saying that over and over again, and or document wishes, instructions and personal values, And the important thing is this Advance Care Directives gets activated at any point at which you lose decision-making capacity. Okay, so you write it and you write, some people get confused. They say, if I write down I don't want resuscitation, that means I can never have resuscitation or can't have this ever again. What it means is that this form only applies when you've lost decision-making capacity. Now, probably if you need resuscitation, you probably don't have decision-making capacity. Now, key points about the Advance Care Directive. It covers not just healthcare. It's not just about end of life either. It applies in any, it has regard to residential and personal decisions, but not financial matters, because financial matters is covered by power of attorney. That's still a separate document. Next thing is, and this is the most important thing that I have to emphasise, an Advance Care Directive, if you appoint an SDM and a subject decision maker, they can make lawful decisions for you. They basically become you. Right? So if I put my wife who's over there as my subject decision maker, and if I lose decision-making capacity, right, you have to go through, a doctor has to go through her to provide me with treatment. Just as before somebody can put a needle into me, they're going to have to consent. Well, if I haven't got decision-making capacity and she's there, you have to go through her. So basically her job then is to make the decision that she thinks I would have made. So she's me. The next thing is that you can write non-binding requests on this. So you can write things that you would like done, but you can also write what we call binding refusals. And these are refusals, the things that we've talked about before and Ian's mentioned before, things you don't want done. These must be complied with if the doctor believes that it's relevant to a situation. Now, I am going to tell you that SA has great legislation supporting end-of-life care. Okay, I've seen a lot of the others, and really South Australia's got really balanced legislation. People just aren't aware of it. And the basic ones, it's basically enshrined within the Advance Care Directives Act 2013 and also the Consent to Medical Treatment and Palliative Care Act 1995. Now, the reason why, and I'll just run through these, reason why it's very balanced, it really enshrines several things. It makes clear, number one, it makes these things clear, that there's one form. We don't have to deal with 5 different forms. We know that there's one form and this set of laws works around it. Next thing is we know how to decide. Remember I mentioned before, the basic tenet of the law, there's a basic aspect of this law is that we all try to make decisions that the person would have made. That's what you should be doing. You should be trying to make the decision that the individual would have wanted had they been conscious. We know who to ask. That's called, there's a special consent hierarchy. There's a very clear consent hierarchy, a hierarchy of people we have to take the advice from. There's an order, which we'll go through in a moment. And what to do in a dispute. There's a very clear dispute resolution process. The first step is to contact the public advocate and try and get a determination from them. Because being frank, in end-of-life situations, and you can understand why, there's very high likelihood of disputes in those situations. Not just between the healthcare system and individuals, it's often between the individuals within a family. Now, these two are really important for a doctor's point of view. The legislation made very clear that there's no requirement for a doctor to provide treatment which is of no medical benefit to a dying patient, right? See, one of the things that's misunderstood by some doctors is that you have to give the 50th option, the last type of chemotherapy that has a 1% chance of working, that's going to cause you a lot of harm, but it's going to keep you alive for another week. But really, that's not really of great medical benefit, is it? Especially if it's $100,000 and could actually pay for a teacher for a year, let's be frank. But, you know, the benefit is not there. But the thing is that there's no requirement for that individual to provide that treatment. The other thing is that doctors are protected in giving enough medication to maintain the comfort and dignity of a dying patient. They can give you enough stuff, enough medication, as long as their intention is to maintain your comfort and dignity. So, the point about this, surety about these 6 points, is it makes a much more clear end-of-life situations, there's less chance of conflict, and allows a doctor to have greater focus on care instead of the disputes, which are likely to happen. But I just want to point those last two, 5 and 6, I want to just indicate the reason why I think it's great legislation is it's in line with the doctor's professional standards. These are doctor's professional standards. These are the APRA Medical Board of Australia, Good Medical Practice, a Code of Conduct for Doctors in Australia. So these are the standards by which a doctor is actually, if you're in trouble, and they will actually judge you against. These are that a doctor needs to understand the limits of medicine in prolonging life and recognise when efforts to prolong life may not benefit the patient. Understand that you do not have a duty to prolong life at all cost. However, you do have a duty to know when not to initiate and when to cease attempts of prolonging life, plus, the most important thing, while ensuring that your patients receive appropriate relief from distress. So that is a doctor's... See, some people are under the misunderstanding that our job is to keep on applying the 50th option, you know, when really it's of not much benefit. And some doctors are actually under that pressure, but we're not. Our job is to actually offer stuff that's of medical benefit, but at the point at which it's not actually going to do you any more good, our job is to make sure that you don't suffer. Okay, so I'll move on to why do we need advanced care planning and advanced care directives? And I think Ian's actually indicated a lot of the reasons why. But the first thing is that you understand that end-of-life situations are filled with emotion and fear. I mean, they are scary times and it's a lot of uncertainty. Complaints are extremely common in these situations, okay? But the reasons include that the involvement of multiple family members with different values or understanding of what's going on. Plus, and this is where I'm going to talk about the doctor situation. Doctors in a situation like this have a lot to consider, including legal concerns, where there are no second chances, and they cannot read minds. You know, if you're coming in from outside, they don't know you. And they're human. And it's very easy for them to apply their own values to the situation. It's hard not to, as a doctor, to be frank. So in that situation, doctors are often going through a whole lot of things, and these are sort of things that go through their mind. My belief is that life is sacrosanct. What is the protocol in this situation? What did the textbook say? What did the consultant do the last time this happened? What are the clinical parameters that will tell me that this patient is the end of their life? What's best for this patient? My job is only to save lives, isn't it? What's this legal situation if I don't give treatment? Maybe I'd better just keep them alive. What's this bit of paper, an advanced care directive? What's this plan? What's this person calling themselves a medical power of attorney? What do I do? And that's an advert for the fact that we don't want 50 different forms. We want one form. His children are saying we should let him go, but his wife is saying that we must keep him alive. What do I do? And that's a really common situation that we have. How do I know how to tell them bad news? I need to give them hope. Maybe I'll just give him one more round of treatment. It's a really easy thing to do. It's a lot easier to do that than actually have the discussion sometimes. And what would this patient have wanted had they been conscious? Now that, I think I've indicated to you, is the basic premise of the Advance Care Directives Act, that we've got to be focusing on that. And that's what we need to try and teach everybody. Everybody in a room trying to make a decision for an individual should be focusing on that. But how should this all work in the real world? Now this is what, I want to go through a bit of a case and I'll just take you through the journey of what should happen and what can go wrong. Okay, so I've picked a case of an individual with very severe Parkinson's disease. I've done this for a reason. The first thing is I want to get away from cancer as being the only reason that people die, because there's a lot of other reasons. So Betty is an 82-year-old widow. She lives alone with supports. She has severe deteriorating Parkinson's disease on maximum treatment. She has mobility problems and she's had a lot of falls. She's got swallowing difficulties at this stage because it's so severe, with episodes of pneumonia and choking. She's had lots of admissions for the falls and the pneumonia and the swallowing problems and choking. She has a really supportive daughter, Anne, who lives nearby, who visits her often and actually cares for her much of the time. She's got a son, John, in Brisbane, who rarely visits, and he actually really cannot accept that his mum is really ill. Common story? Okay. The things most important to Betty are her dignity, independence, good food and wine. She fears most being bedbound, especially living in a nursing home. She has said, and I've heard this so often, I'd be happy to fly away one day. And please don't let me do anything. Don't let them do anything to me to stop that. What would be a good thing to for her to do at this point, do you think? Very good, okay. So the first thing is that a really good idea would be to do an advanced care directive, okay. So on this advanced care directive, the likely thing she's going to do is make Anne her substitution maker, and she's going to write down those wishes, isn't she? Right? And she write there, I do not want to end up in a nursing home, okay. And then the next thing is what do you do with this form? Okay, you've got this bit of form. What are the odds that it never gets to the point where it's required by the doctor or the hospital? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but one place you can do it now is the My Health Record, which is the National Electronic Health Record, where it's possible, if you have one, to scan and upload your Advance Care Directive, and theoretically it's available to other doctors. It's not there yet, but it's possible. The other thing that is possible is that if you end up in hospital, you can actually get them to, well, they're supposed to actually ask you about your Advance Care Directive and also ask who your substitute decision maker is. So that's what should happen. Okay, let's talk about what actually happens next. Betty presents at an emergency department. She's found at home on the floor by a neighbour. She has pneumonia, dehydration and acute delirium because of the pneumonia. Doctor assesses she would require IV fluids and antibiotics to recover. She now does not have decision-making capacity. The situation is the Advance Care Directive is actually available. It was scanned into the hospital computer system. And her substitute decision maker manages to arrive, and she's there. And John has rung, though, and he's demanded that everything be done. So you've got this conflict. So the doctor's actually a bit scared because there's no second chances at this point, right? What should happen, and let's talk about what might happen. What should happen is this. This is the decision-making process that should happen. The first thing that should happen is a doctor obviously has to decide what the possible treatments are, but really what they need to decide is, does that individual have decision-making capacity, right? They need to work out, can they make a decision? Now, decision-making capacity is actually very poorly understood by a lot of people. It's not a medical diagnosis. All it is the ability to do four things. You have to be able to understand what's being communicated. You have to be able to keep it in your mind long enough to be able to put two and two together. You have to be able to put two and two together, and you have to be able to express a decision. If you fail to do one of those, you can't make a decision. That's common sense, isn't it? That's what it is. So a doctor should be actually computing that in their mind. Can this individual make a decision? Now, in this case, she can't, right? So the second thing that should happen is they need to look for the Advance Care Directive, and they should be, as I said, looking on the My Health Record, ideally, in the ideal world. That's probably not happening very often at the moment, but look in the Advance Care Directive, but also look for it on the hospital system, and that's possible in this case. The next thing they should do is, remember I talked about the consent hierarchy? Now remember the situation with John. We've got a problem because John's calling up, and you've got Anne there. The good thing about the legislation in South Australia is a very clear hierarchy. What you're supposed to do is actually go down this consent hierarchy, which is, okay, basically if a person can make decisions, they should make decisions, shouldn't they? Next person down is substitution maker. Below that is the wishes in an Advance Care Directive, and below that is what we call persons responsible. At this moment in time, Anne is there, but John isn't. So who do we go to? Correct. And that's because Betty trusted Anne to make the call. Okay? And we'll talk about the people you should be picking. You don't always pick the person who's the most lovely or loves you the most. You pick the person that is able to make that decision for you when the crunch comes, because it's a hard decision. Next thing is likely what will happen is Anne will say, don't give her any more treatment. She's had enough. The decision was made before. She's had enough. She knows she's going to end up in a nursing home now. Just treat her palliatively, so she could be given medications, morphine, for example. Now, there could be a dispute at this moment in time because John's ringing up and going, oh, what's going on, what's going on? Theoretically, what you can do, there's a simplified dispute resolution process, which is the Public Advocate Mediation Service. So theoretically, you could actually refer John off to that. Okay? Now, that's what should happen. Now, the problem is I think you're saying, Chris, you're living in an idealised world. Well, that's because I get back to this issue again. The doctors particularly are actually caught quite often. They feel, sometimes they're not very clear about the legislation. They don't understand what the ethical responsibilities are. And sometimes they're really caught. They're trying to do the right thing, but they really feel quite scared because there are no second chances on this decision. But this is why it's important to understand what your role is as a substitution maker. Understand the legal standing you've got at that point, right? Because they're caught up with this. And it's really scary. And Christine is a palliative care specialist who had to teach a lot of younger doctors, and it's very difficult because it's a very difficult path to go through. Now, I would say to you, we'll talk a bit about negotiating the medical system, but I would say have some compassion for your doctor, but you need to be firm. Okay, subsequent events. Betty survives the pneumonia for whatever reason. She's deteriorated. She's now bed and chair bound. She's fully dependent for care. She's swallowing worse with more choking and aspiration. She's incontinent now. This is probably her worst nightmare. She actually ends up in a nursing home, and I've been caught with this before. She ends up in a nursing home but couldn't stand it and actually demands to get out. And look, puts an incredible burden at that point on the family who love her so much enough to do this. Betty's GP, she's refused to stay there, so Betty's GP sets up a family conference, end-of-life care discussed. She's alert, aware of what's happened, understands what she's told, can speak to express her wishes, which have not changed. What should the GP do now? So I'm going to talk to you about the sort of things that a GP could do to put things together to try and get this right. So obviously, the ACD's been done, the Advance Care Directive should have been done. Second thing is that this thing called the resuscitation plan 7-step pathway should be filled out. So remember I said she's written out wishes, but those clinical instructions are not going to be very useful for an ambulance officer in the middle of the night. So doctor should convert these into wishes. And the two things that are relevant here, not for resuscitation or no life-prolonging treatment, probably for her. She doesn't want any more treatment. But you might tick the not for hospital transfer unless the palliative care measures fail to maintain the comfort and dignity of the patient or resident in her place of residence. So the GP could do that. So that's what the ambulance officer would like to see if the crunch comes. Because they would get that a doctor's gone through a process to make a decision with the individual and would know what to do in the middle of the night when the emergency happens. Because I think you do need to keep thinking about what the poor ambulance officer or the doctor who's never met you before is having to, you know, they're scared of doing the wrong thing. So having greater certainty about this helps a lot. The next thing is probably a referral to palliative care. And we can talk a bit about what palliative care is. And potentially sorting out medications in anticipation of potential problems, like making sure she doesn't get anxious or that she gets, you know, there's a lot of things that can happen, but we'll talk about those things later. But palliative care is about improving the quality of her life in the time she has. Making sure the pharmacy's got medications, getting the thing up on My Health Record. And the other thing was this thing called a GP, well, I'm involved with this thing called GP Palliative Shared Care Program. And so we have this purple folder. And so the idea of it is another way of getting that information there. What we have in there is the Advance Care Directive, 7-step pathway, contact details for the individual to call in emergency because they're scared. So, you know, Anne's carers are scared, so they need somebody to call. It has the past history and it also has the medications. So if the ambulance officers turn up, they see this purple folder, they've got all the information there, they're far more likely to respond appropriately instead of pulling up stumps and sending you to hospital. And in fact, nowadays, the extended care paramedics can actually provide palliative care to try and get you through to the morning and hopefully hand over to your GP. We are also doing some work with the locums to see whether we can get them to be providing a lot more care to get you through to the morning so that your normal GP can take over, or the palliative care service. There is work there. Still work to be done. Now, I'm just about finished. I've talked to you about, I hope you get this idea about the rights issue, about why it's important as a rights issue, because it's protecting you, it's you. The form is you, it's a representative of you, and the individuals who actually work from it should be actually thinking about what you want. So it's a protection of rights. But I want to talk to you about this. Betty dies peacefully at home. But a few months later, Anne visits her GP, she's upset and says, maybe we should have done more. What should the GP say to Anne? Now, I get this quite often because they come back to see me. And I know the first thing is that when people die, it's not the person who dies who suffers, it's actually the people around them. And the thing about it is it's often the guilt that comes with it and what happened, the decision making. So what I often say to them is, because this has happened, I say to them, hey, think about this. Remember what we went through, the decisions that we made, what Betty said. You know, you did an amazingly good thing, amazingly loving thing by trying to hold to what she wanted. Okay? It was a gift to her. But better still, she gave a gift to you because she gave you certainty about what we wanted. So do you understand why this is a matter of love as well? That it's a gift both ways. And it's an incredible gift because otherwise there's this possibility with the uncertainty. And I think Ian alluded to that. Had that not been there, they might have had these fights. And well, the legacy of Betty might have been the fights that happened in the family, not this. So I hope, therefore, I sort of convinced you or implored you to get an Advance Care Directive, but also go out there and advertise for this and understand why it's a rights issue for the consumers. But understand that Advance Care Directives are a matter of love, rights and self-determination. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. It was really valuable to hear about Advance Care Directives from a medical professional's point of view too. I'd now like to introduce you to Miss Alison Wallace. Come along, Miss. Alison's worked in health and education and community and disability sectors for over 30 years. It's being a bit kind, I thought it was longer.
Does it really say 30?
Yeah.
I mustn't have written that.
As a nurse, advocate and policy maker, and has recently joined the HCA team. Her work in these areas has meant that she's developed an understanding and commitment to supporting people to and in making decisions about their end-of-life care, having supported a number of family members and several close friends through this process. She's passionate about the importance of people considering what they want to happen and making their end-of-life wishes clear to their support network and health providers. Alison has encouraged her family and friends to think and talk openly about this and has supported many of them to document their last wishes and Advance Care Directive. Please welcome Ms. Alison Wallace.
So I'm here to talk to you about Bill's story. This is Bill and I'm Bill's daughter. My parents are very different people. The one thing they had in common, their concerns about their ageing and their dying were have handled those in very different ways. The one thing they have in common is both of them wanted to have as much control over their dying as they have had over their life, and boy, are they both control freaks. They also wanted to maintain their independence as far as possible. My father did this by working through the process that I'm going to talk to you about in terms of an Advance Care Directive. My mother has done that by continuing to worry so much about the loss of her youth and the concerns about her ageing and her fear about loss of independence, that she still isn't in a place where she can openly have that conversation. She'd rather, as she says to me, I'll deny it as long as I can. What I've done is left that open to her and said, I'm happy to have that conversation with you. And every now and then I revisit that and say, would you like to have a conversation about this? And up until this point, she says, back off, I'll let you know when. That would be my mother. Bill, however, was very different, and we certainly moved down the path of an Advance Care Directive. And being a nurse and being the daughter of my parents, I'm also a bit of a control freak. And being a policy writer and a person who loves to develop forms, filling out forms is also very appealing to me somehow. I think my father had this discussion with me because he knew I didn't really have a life, and so filling out a form for him was probably, something we could occupy our time with. So how did we start the discussion? My father approached me only a couple of years before his death about would I help him with his will. He wanted to write it. He hadn't had one up until then. I'd nagged him about that, and he said, I think it's time. I want to get all my ducks in a row. I've hidden some money in the cushion in the couch. I've put masking tape on the back of things in the house with people's names on them that I want them to have. I've got myself a funeral plan, and I just want to make sure none of this stuff is left to any of you. So when we talked, and we did do his will, and we worked through that process, and so that gave me the opportunity to have a discussion about having an Advance Care Directive with him. And he was unsure about what that was, but it also raised some concerns about he didn't really know how to talk about his death because he didn't know what it was going to ultimately look like, and that's a fair comment. So the one thing when we did start the conversation was, what he said was he didn't want things like no heroic treatment or the end stage of a terminal illness, because he said, I don't know what they mean. They sound very medical to me, and I don't think I'll know when I'm at the end stage of a terminal illness, so how will I know what decision to make about that? But he did have some very clear intent about how he saw the end of his life. And so we talked about what do you want that to look like, and what things do you value, and we can put those sorts of things into the directive and be really clear. So although eventually we sort of had some very clear indications about what treatment at what stage he would refuse. What was most important to him was, in fact, making clear what his intent was. So any health practitioner who had final carriage of decisions about treatment understood who he was and what was important to him. And he felt that was a way to help people make decisions. So this is what, in the end point, he talked to me about, and this is what we ultimately wrote into his Advance Care Directive. As long as possible, I want to live my life independently, even if this requires domestic or personal care support. I do not want to live in a nursing home. This would be the very last resort for me. I do not want any medical treatment that would ultimately result in me having to live in a nursing home. In the event of cardiac arrest, I do not want to be resuscitated at the end stage of my life where it might prolong my life without quality of life. The things that were important to my father, which in fact we didn't put into the Advanced Care Directive, was smoking. My father had smoked his entire life from when he was 13. He had a mild stroke when he was 56 and gave up smoking for 5 years and then returned to smoking, but he was a very heavy smoker. The other thing that was really important to my father was brandy, and he liked to have brandy. He had brandy and milk at breakfast time, and he had brandy with his corned beef sandwich for lunch, and he had brandy with his devilled sausages for tea, and generally when he was watching something at the end of the night, he had a bit of a toddy to finish off the day. The reason my father didn't want to go into a nursing home was because he didn't want to not be able to smoke, and he didn't want to not be able to drink his brandy. And in reality, they were the most important things to him. So I understood that. I didn't think we needed to share that information. I thought just as an ultimate last resort was enough in making that decision. So my father died in 2015. He wasn't in the end stage of a terminal illness at the beginning of the process. He was an emergency situation. He was found unconscious by the people that came to clean his unit. They'd been contacted by Meals on Wheels, who had turned up on a Monday morning and found that his meal was still there from the Friday before. He was rushed to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and it was found that he had a ruptured bowel. And so there was a need to rush him into emergency surgery, which I consented to. I talked to the other members of my family. My mother and father had been divorced for 20 years, but had become ultimate friends is probably a bit more. Some mutual respect and some lived history is probably what their relationship ended up being. I have 3 siblings. I talked to all of them. The rest of my family didn't want to come into the hospital for quite some time. They were quite uncomfortable with that, and they felt that as the family nurse that it was best for me to do that because they thought I would, do what was necessary. But I spoke to all of my family members through all of the stages. My father came out of surgery into ICU. He hadn't regained consciousness. They'd resected 2/3 of his bowel, and he had a colostomy bag on the outside, which is bringing a part of his bowel onto the outside of his stomach, and he had a bag. He also, during that time, his kidneys had failed, and so in ICU, they'd commenced him on a round of dialysis to try and get his kidneys to work. During none of this time did he regain consciousness. At the end of that point, that still didn't kick in his kidneys, and so the doctors talked to me about starting another round of dialysis, and at which point I had a conversation with them about what we needed to do next and what we needed to talk about in terms of his Advance Care Directive. So there were 3 things that I asked him. I asked for a meeting with the head of the ICU unit and also the medical specialist, the surgeon. And I asked them these things. What's the likelihood of a reversal of the colostomy bag in the long term? What's the likelihood of returning to full renal function or even good renal function if he started another round of dialysis or kept up with that? And what was the likelihood of him ever being able to return home at the end of this? And to each of those things they said, we could possibly get his kidneys working. We don't think it's possible to reverse the colostomy, and he probably would not be able to live independently. For me, that immediately told me that his wishes were that he didn't want anything that would put him in a nursing home, and I knew that he wouldn't cope with those things. I knew the thought of having to go to dialysis twice a week and having to manage a colostomy and moving into a nursing home would not be my father's wishes. And so we talked then about discontinuing that treatment, not restarting dialysis, and enacting his Advance Care Directive, which the medical specialists were comfortable with and certainly then documented in his notes. The following day, interestingly enough, I was actually driving to get wood for the fire. My daughter and I were heading up to Mount Barker, and while we were in the car, I phoned the hospital to see how he'd gone that day, and I was told by the nurse that they were about to restart the dialysis because they'd done some bloods and the indications were they needed to do that. So I asked to immediately speak to the doctor on duty at that time and informed him of the Advance Care Directive and the fact that we would not be undertaking any further dialysis. That doctor was very concerned at that point in time, and his comments were that that we couldn't discontinue treatment, that I would need to come in and sign a release to do that, and in his medical view there was a need and a reasonable rationale for commencing dialysis. I told him I was turning the car around and would be there in 45 minutes. I told him just because the notes had moved on to a new page didn't mean he didn't have to read the previous pages. I said I'd give him 15 minutes to have a conversation with whoever he needed to, and I would then ring him back from the car. I told him if he commenced any treatment before I arrived at the hospital, I would have his guts for garters. I rang back in 15 minutes and he said, "I fully understand, we won't be recommencing treatment and we'll see you when you get here." At that point, I talked to them in ICU about this is no longer the place for him. You know, it's time now to move him out of ICU onto a ward, and I asked them to make the referral to the palliative care team. He was moved onto a ward. The remainder of my family members and his brother were able to visit him, and he died 4 days later without having a return to consciousness. He was comfortable. He was comfortable in his death at the end of that time, and everybody had been to see him. It's hard to know whether that's a good death because I didn't go through it, but for me, we did everything in our power to achieve what it was that he wanted. So this is some of the rest of the members of my family. This was at my daughter's 21st. My father is the pirate, as you can see. My brother is brandishing the scaber. That's my sister and my daughter, who's 28. All of my family members have an Advance Care Directive, except my mother, and I've told you that reason why. My daughter has one. She travelled a couple of years ago overseas for quite a long period of time, and we talked about it. The time to talk about it is why it's a hypothetical, and while you can have a bit of a laugh, you know, I think when it's not real and it doesn't touch a nerve or fear. My daughter says sometimes it's really difficult having a health practitioner as a mother because we've had conversations over the years that she didn't really feel she wanted to have. But she has that, and we've had very clear discussions about what we want. I know that I know the intent and the wishes and the values of the rest of my family, and I feel safe because they know mine, and I think that's a good place to be with family. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear your experience with your dad in using an Advance Care Directive, and great to hear that your extended family have all got Advance Care Directives. The things your daughters say, mine tend to say as well. Now I've got a granddaughter who repeats them as well. Even though there is the view out there that only older people need them, it's not true. You know, these Advance Care Directives, we all need them. It's just not an old person thing, it's a young person thing as well. And it's sad that people think that way. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Chris Moy back. So thank you, Alison, and welcome Chris back. And Chris is going to introduce and chair the panel. So thank you, Chris. You've got to get everyone up here now.
Yeah, I do. We'll have Ian up if that's okay, first up. and Alison as well. And the other people we're introducing are going to be, and I'm doing really well here. Oh, God. Christine Drummond. Sorry. And Christine is a senior palliative care medical consultant at Central Adelaide Local Health Network. She's had significant clinical expertise and experience in palliative care, general practice, emergency medicine, and the ability to appreciate and examine the healthcare system from a variety of angles. She's actually been working with me for many years, and she has a wider perspective of end-of-life care, I think, than most. This is supported by passion for community-based healthcare, hospital avoidance, particularly end of life, and a strong sense of social justice and a belief that healthcare organisations' primary purpose is to build healthcare capacity within the community. We've got Gaynor Stevenson, who is, now Gaynor is National Senior My Health Record Jurisdictional Education Lead for SANT, ACT, Tasmania, Victoria and WA. So that misses out New South Wales. Why? Okay, fair enough.
And I live in Queensland.
So she'll be talking about the My Health Record. She's an experienced senior director and executive with a demonstrated history of working in hospital and healthcare, as well as local and Commonwealth health departments. We'll bring up Karen now, please. And what have I done, Karen? I've got the bio here. What have I done with it? Oh, that's why. Oh, it is too. Sorry. Oh, God, I didn't practice. So Karen is the first nurse in Australia to be endorsed as a nurse practitioner in the specialty of palliative care. Before retirement, just very recently, she worked for almost 30 years in the Southern Adelaide Palliative Care Service and is considered a pioneer in palliative care in South Australia. She's received numerous awards throughout her career, including an AM recently, and for services to nursing and palliative care, people living with motor neuron disease, which is a particular interest in hers, and a Churchill Fellowship to research the palliative care needs of individuals with physical and intellectual disabilities. She's currently working part-time for elder care and conducting advanced care planning clinics. And finally, not least, we have Lee Whiteman. Now, Lee is the Manager of Policy and Legislation for Department of Health and Ageing. So she, within SA Health, kind of provides the policy and direction for the Advance Care Directives Act. She was originally trained as a social worker and later completed a Master's in Policy and Administration at Flinders University. She's worked in child protection policy for a number of years in NTNSA, and she's worked in the Community Services Policy and Department of Human Services. When that department was disbanded, she moved to the Health Policy and Legislation, where she is currently, although there have been a few restructures along the way, and there might be some more. The Advance Care Directives Act is one of her number of acts for which she has responsibility. So thank you all for coming. Now, so look, what we'll do first is I might just direct some questions to the panel first, and then we're going to open it up. So if you've got some questions, start thinking those up, and we'll start pointing. I'll start pointing, and we'll take the microphone towards you. So we do have some microphones there. So Ian,
yep.
I'll start with you first, because it's quite interesting, because I have sometimes, I mean, obviously from a doctor's point of view, if I start talking about wasted resources, it almost looks like I'm rationing resources, and I feel like I sound like a really heartless soul. But I must say that you've actually been a strong advocate for that, because I want to. Do you think it's reasonable to be discussing that? You know,
I think it is. I think it is important to discuss the issue of how we are going to look at it. I mean, my job now is as the Chief Advocate for National Seniors Australia, and we've got a couple 100,000 members, and we've just had a minister today announce that he's going to toughen up regulations to do with aged care, and he's going to have unannounced visits into aged care facilities, and they want to try and improve the pay for people. And so you've got to sit around and say to yourself, well, if there's a limited amount of money that's available, how do you best spend it? And I don't think that there's anything wrong with having a conversation about the fact that $150 million, according to the University of Queensland study last year, was wasted on unnecessarily ICU treatments. We saw, for example, in the examples that we had tonight, that if we had said, I want Richard on a respirator, I want him, intubated, I want him fed. I mean, Richard could have spent 3 weeks in ICU with no gain at all, just a great loss to us, because we would have had to watch that, and it would have been a waste of resources. So I mean, I'd like a show of hands. How many people here think that I'm being cruel and unkind by suggesting that we're wasting money? How many people think I'm being rational and sensible? Okay, so there you go. I mean, if you're a doctor, people are reasonable people. You know, if you give people a reason for why you're doing something, they will follow the reasoning. And I think one of the big problems we've got in our society at the moment is that no one actually has reasoned arguments. You know, if you say, well, let's have a look at this. If we spend a lot of money in intensive care units all over Australia as people age, then we won't have money for employing, I don't know, English teachers for migrants. We won't have money for roads. We won't have money. I mean, health is still, I think, the biggest cost to our community. So if we treat it as something special that we have to be very careful about, I think it's a good thing. And that then the person is actually giving a gift to the community as well. I mean, Richard's gift to the community was, I didn't waste a lot of money at the end of my life.
That's lovely.
And the same thing with Bill, wasn't it? Bill? Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. He'd be one of those people saying, I don't want you wasting money on me.
Well, he's of the generation that says, I don't want to be a financial burden on my family, and I don't want to be a financial burden on the community. So that would absolutely be his view.
And I just want to say while we're here that Karen looked after my sister-in-law. That's a typical Adelaide story, isn't it? And she knows my brother. So there you go. Isn't that wonderful? And I'm glad that she only retired in March and not last March. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had such a lovely person looking after my sister-in-law.
Thank you.
Comment in. I think what you've said is really, really important. I think the conversations about resourcing are not conversations that we can have at a bedside. These are conversations that need to happen in our community. So as clinicians, our primary responsibility is to care for our patients, and I look at it from the point of view of not to inflict unnecessary suffering on people. So we don't ever go into the resource conversation. I think that's really disrespectful to family who are grieving and who want to make sure that they've done everything that's appropriate, because it's, as you pointed out, it's not often the patients that want things done, it's the family members who want to feel that they've done everything for their loved one that they should have.
But I mean,
So,
I'm saying having the conversation before you get to hospital. And you can have the conversation now and say, well, look, you know, does the community think it's worthwhile spending a lot of valuable dollars of intensive care time on people who don't themselves probably even want to be in that situation? And the only reason they're in there is because you haven't had the discussion.
Exactly. And the same conversation happens in my mind around chemotherapy, of which there are more and more and more and more options now with ever hopeful outcomes, and people go down that path increasingly. It's very hard to turn the boat around when it's there in a clinical space, not in a community space.
Could I stay with you for a second, Christine? Alison, when you were talking about that case, I was quite struck because you just said it exactly the way it is. When that chap rang you up again and said you need treatment. And you know, that was the thought bubble person. You know, they were going through their list of protocols about what's supposed to happen, and they weren't really thinking this one out. And do you understand why the Advance Care Directive and the substitute decision maker holding the line and actually understanding their role and trying to get back to substitute judgment decision-making standard, which is doing what the individuals wanted, is really where you had to get to. But that person had got out of that mould. Now, the thing about it is that Christine actually has some experience in that, because in Lowell McEwen, she took another role a few years ago where she actually spent quite a lot of time teaching not just palliative care specialists, but other doctors about this, which is not as easy as you think. And look, could I talk to you about what do you think is, I mean, you've got the situation with explaining to people out there their rights, but then you've got another issue within hospitals about teaching doctors about their rights. What's their sort of understanding about Advance Care Directives, and what effect did it have when you started to teach them about the legal and ethical aspects, and what it's, you know, because I think there were some figures that showed there were some effects on ICU.
There certainly were,
So,
yeah. And yeah, not just about ICU, but in general respecting a person's autonomy. That's what our law is all about, and it reflects the values that our society holds in high regard, doesn't it? And it also reflects the complexity of the society we live in, doesn't it? That families are much more complex now than they ever were. Medical interventions and the health system is much more complex. So there has to be something that helps us sort through differing opinions and differing treatments and options. So I think having the Advance Care Directives is very important from that point of view. And I actually think that with our program of teaching, I went around the whole of the Northern Adelaide Local Health Network, every single clinical space, including Aboriginal health, and I taught people and discussed Advance Care Directives. And it was really interesting, in particular, going to Aboriginal health and people saying, oh, this is not what we do. You know, this is a voluntary activity. We can't force people to do this. However, this is not what we do in Aboriginal culture. And I said, but we want to get this right. How do we know who we should be talking to? The biggest thing message that I could get across to people was, who would you like to speak on your behalf if you are unable to make a decision for yourself? Regardless of whether that's end of life or not, what if you're under anaesthetic and something changes when the surgeon gets into the operation and needs permission to do something other than what was decided on in the middle of an operation? What happens if you've got a mental illness? You may not be at end of life. This is not just about end of life. How do we know? How do we get it right when we look for somebody to get consent from? So one of the people in the Aboriginal Health Forum, for example, said to me, well, you know, we went through the consent hierarchy, and she said to me, well, this doesn't fit. This is not what I would do. I would expect my daughter, I haven't seen her for 5 years, but it's her bloody job to do this, she said to me. She lives interstate. And I said, well, you need to write that down, because you come into the ED where I work and I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to talk to the wrong person. So please help me understand what the right thing to do is. The other important thing we found around the teaching was that a lot of the doctors, in particular, the junior ones, are the ones who get this job quite often, because the seniors, you think about the surgeons, they're doing surgery all day long. They're not talking at length to people. It's the junior doctors who get to do it. And it's a highly skilled conversation that they know they can do harm if they do it wrongly. So they really appreciated having some sort of a framework around how to start that conversation. And in your situation, one of the things I would have said for that son who called from interstate was, well, how are we supporting him? He's distressed. He's coming from a point of view of, I've had nothing to do with my mum. I'm angry. I've got to advocate now. How do we actually support him at the same time as getting the right decision happening here for what his mother would have wanted? So, you know, we may not need to get to dispute resolution if we know how to handle that conversation. So that one of the things they found was that it was very, very helpful. And we found doctors, once they'd had some success, then felt that they could have more and more conversations because they were doing it well. We all know if we do something well, we want to do it again. If we do it badly, we avoid it. So that was one of the outcomes. And what we had was more and more resuscitation plans happening, not based on a person's age, but based on their condition and their situation. So that was a really good outcome. And we also had a change in the kinds of patients that were being sent to intensive care. And all I had time to look at were the people who are over 80 years of age, but they were being sent there for different reasons and having better outcomes. So we were no longer sending people with what we call multi-organ failure who have no hope of getting through this. We were sending people who maybe had had a big operation, who might have needed some extra monitoring for the 24 hours. And that's good practice. That's not bad practice. So our patient cohort was changing, and I think that was a really good outcome.
So in many ways, it gets back to what you were saying, Ian, before, that the right people are being treated and the bed wasn't being taken by somebody for which the treatment was of no benefit, but the people that was of benefit that were getting treatment.
And also I just want to mention one other thing. Professor Graham Hugo, the late Professor Graham Hugo, did a study for the Health Department a few years ago, and he actually said that the group that I belong to, that I sit smack in the middle of, is the baby boomers. He said they are 3 times more likely to have comorbidities than their parents. You know, they're actually not. So, you know, there are a lot of people. I mean, Richard didn't have diabetes; he only had COPD. But there are people that have got diabetes and they've got COPD and they've got other issues and they've got heart problems, heart failure, all this. So, I mean, there's a big question around. I mean, this idea that we're all going to live well and we're all going to be living to 150 and all that. It's not actually the case. I mean, there is a mixed bag out there.
Absolutely.
You know, so I think you actually have to think about what you're actually doing for the quality of life of those people by taking them in there and this very expensive treatment that is ultimately not going to work.
Well, that's actually a good segue into Karen. I was going to ask you a question. The next question was, I picked this case particularly because this case was not a cancer situation and pain was not the primary issue, because everybody focuses on pain and cancer being palliative care. But I mean, palliative care, you work in a similar area, I suppose, where movement disorder and swallowing issues are major, breathing issues are major as well, which is motor neuron disease. What ultimately is palliative care to an individual out there? I mean, what is the aim? What are you trying to do? And what can be brought to bear that is of benefit in this situation, including John? I mean, John, you know, because Betty survived in this case, and John's still out there distressed. So what does palliative care offer in this situation?
Well, I guess palliative care really is a concept of care. It's a type of care for people who, you know, have any illness of any, you know, that ultimately at some stage will limit their life. So, you know, what we try to offer people is comfort, relief of, you know, any distressing symptoms, you know, and that doesn't always mean not treating things. And I think that's what a lot of people, you know, don't realise palliative care. They think it means doing nothing, but it actually is quite active care in some situations if it's going to improve the symptoms, that whatever the illness. And, you know, Chris used the example of motor neuron disease, which I've worked in for a long time, and, you know, there are issues around swallowing, breathing, and you know, that's when we have the conversations with people. Okay, you know, when we get to that stage, what treatment would you want, you know, at that point, or what treatment would you not want at that point? That's in you know, with the individual, if that's possible, or as we've been talking about now, the substitute decision maker. So that's why it's really important that that person knows, you know, what you would want in that situation. But I guess it's giving people a range of options and saying, well, this is what we can do, and then, you know, trying to come to some agreement around what's the most appropriate, considering where they are at that point in time.
The other aspect, though, with John in mind, because John is the one out there distressed.
Yeah.
I mean, psychosocial aspects, you know, the psychological and emotional aspects are almost just as important.
Look, I think, you know, I'm a strong advocate for case conferencing. You know, I think it's much better if you can to get everybody in the same room, and if John physically can't be there, it's about getting John on the phone while conversation's taking place with all involved in the care, and that's both the family as well as the health professionals, and, you know, coming to some consensus around what is, you know, the most appropriate way to deal with this, and making sure that John has some opportunity to voice his opinions, to you know, try and reach agreement, you know, be involved in the whole decision-making process. And yeah, it isn't always easy when you do have one family member that's opposing, but I think if everyone's hearing the same conversation at the same time, you've got a much better chance of having an outcome that everyone may not totally agree with, but, you know, at least everyone's had the opportunity to be involved in that.
Could I just say that, you know, I was saying before, the Advance Care Directive, that it's important to write things that you don't want, but it's also important to write things that you do want beyond that. And the reason why this would be relevant in this situation here is that if Betty had written that I really would like all my family to be together on a decision, that might have changed Anne's position, right? But what if Betty had written, I do not trust John, do not listen to John, because I've seen that before. Do not trust them. Well, you know, it might be a different decision. Do you see what I mean? Those extra things actually add value to a decision that gets made. That's why those things about what you just don't want to do is not the only thing. Yeah. Could I just then go to Lee? We'll talk about Advance Care Directives and the actual Advance Care Directive in South Australia. Where do we get one, and what do I do with it, basically? What should I be doing with it?
Right. You can buy them from Service SA outlets, or if you put Advance Care Directive into a search engine, the first item that comes up should be the Advance Care Directive website. From that website, you can download the equivalent of the kits which are around. Plus, there's two ways. I might have to get a bit of technical assistance from my colleague over here, But there's two different ways that you can fill it out online. Once you've done that, you need to get your substitute decision makers to sign it, if you're going to have substitute decision makers, and then get it witnessed. We recommend that people get certified copies, probably 5 or 6 certified copies, so that substitute decision makers have a copy, you put a copy on the fridge, that you do upload it. Putting one on the fridge is in case the ambulance come and they're instructed to look on the fridge to see if there's any advance care directives there. If you've got a medical record in one of the hospitals, you can take it in there, get it put with your record. It and the 7-step resuscitation pathway have a special sleeve in the medical record so that in theory it's easily found. Probably missed.
It's on EPAS as well.
Yes, it's on.
Yeah. So we can scan the documents into our EPAS. You will have all heard of the EPAS, the wonderful EPAS system. We do scan the documents into that, and an alert comes up on the front page when we call up your medical record to say there's something there, look for it. So that's even can be seen in a resuscitation room if the hospital that you go to is on EPAS. Yeah.
So could I just ask another question, which is about the Advance Care Directive, because I think it's quite a common one, is what some people out here have the old Advance Care Directive, the legal documents, which is enduring guardianship, the medical power of attorney, and also the anticipated direction. Where do they stand if they were completed before July 2014, and what happens now? Or do they need to fill out another form? Or?
No, they don't, but if they want to, they can do an Advance Care Directive. All those documents remain valid, and they'll be treated as an Advance Care Directive should they be used. So what that means in practice is that some of them were based on the old notion of determining what was the best interests of the person concerned, as opposed to what are the wishes of the person concerned. So those documents will be interpreted from the framework of the Advance Care Directive Act. So they're still legally valid, that's the main point.
So anybody who's a medical power of attorney or enduring guardian is a substitute decision maker under the Act, and then anybody who's written wishes under anticipatory direction, they're the wishes of an Advance Care Directive in effect. But what happens if you do complete a new one then? What happens if you've just written an Advance Care Directive and just written some wishes or refusals on a new Advance Care Directive, but there's a medical power of attorney out there? What happens to that form?
Is it a valid Advance Care Directive?
So the previous medical power attorney was valid, but
Yep.
you've got a new Advance Care Directive which has been completed but doesn't have a substitute decision maker on it. Was that medical power of attorney valid anymore after the July the 1st?
Yes, it continues to be. So whoever you name there would continue to be, would be your substitute decision maker, and the remaining parts of your Advance Care Directive would continue to be valid, the new ACD.
Could I now go over to Gaynor? So Gaynor's from the digital agency, Australian Digital Health Agency. So a lot of people have no idea what this is because they get EPAS and My Health Record mixed up in South Australia, and that's not a good thing to get mixed up. But what is My Health Record? How can people get one, and what's happening later this year? And what can people do about their advanced care directives?
Well, a My Health Record is basically an electronic summary of your health information. And you can get one by doing, as you say, a search engine, put My Health Record in, and it will take you to the website where you can register for one at the moment. Currently, we're in the process of moving to My Health Record expansion programme, and later this year there will be a period which we're calling opt-out. So if you don't opt out during that period, by the end of this year, every Australian will have a My Health Record created for them. We're one of the first countries on the planet to do this, so yeah, no pressure. So to get your one thing to remember about it is it's a summary of information that's contained electronically, but each and every one of you are the controllers of that information. So if you don't want something uploaded to your My Health record, it won't be uploaded. If you want to have, say, Chris see this part of your record, but you'll let Alison see the rest of it, so you can actually hide documents and control who accesses your information. At the moment, we're working with a number of community pharmacies, GPs, hospital services to allow clinicians better access to the record from their own systems. EPAS is going to be having its own tab for the clinicians to access My Health record from the EPAS. So that's been rolled out hopefully to all services within South Australia by the end of this year.
So all My Health record is, it's pretty, does anybody use, whose computer, into computers, it's Dropbox, or it's like it's just a file up in the sky, so your GP, your pathology people, the x-ray people, the hospitals can just shove stuff up there. It's the same letters that you get there, the discharge summaries and stuff, but the problem is at the moment is it's all stuck in everybody's computers, but this time it's accessible by somebody else. And the whole aim of this was really, so for me, I still get back to yeah, it's about sharing information. See, I think one of the things that I know from your point of view is that you want to make sure that your wishes are out there, but you see, you have to look at it from a health provider's point of view. The power of that information is so much greater if you've got an advanced care directive telling us what you don't want done and what you do want done, but it's linked to your medical history. Because if we know that you've got end-stage lung disease plus you don't want this, it makes our decision a lot easier and takes that thought bubble situation out of play a lot more quickly.
I just want to say on that we had the problem where Richard had been in and out of hospital so many times, but when it came to the last time, the Advance Care Directive document wasn't there, didn't come in from the nursing home, and we had that, situation of 24 hours. Well, where is it? Why didn't it come in? You've got to go to the nursing home, you've got to get it, you've got to bring it back in, give it to the doctor, call in the palliative care team, and I was very lucky that I had two brothers who were doctors that were doing it. So I'm immensely pleased that, that can now be scanned, put into a record so that you don't have to worry about that as a family at the time. So I think it's brilliant that we're getting it. And I mean, I even said to Chris when I told him the story originally, it should be with your Medicare number. When you go into the hospital and they go swipe or whatever they do with your Medicare card, that number should immediately tell everyone you've got an advanced care directive in the same way as you're an organ donor or whatever else you need. And if that's what's going to happen,
pretty much what it is, actually.
I think it's
so it's
terrific.
actually linked to your Medicare card, but also your other demographic details.
Yeah, but I think it's terrific that that we are in the 21st century. And if we can do all the sorts of things that we can do, then this is the perfect way of doing it and saving a lot of people. I mean, then the doctor doesn't even have to have the discussion. The doctor can actually look at the file and say, right, okay, well, I see what's going on. They don't even have to ask you. They can say, well, they can tell you, oh, your father, brother, sister has got an advanced care directive.
I mean, from my point of view, as I've been an oncology nurse for many years, so this futile chemotherapy business, I'm so with you there. There's a lot of now nurse care coordinators out there who spend hours on the phone trying to find out where Betty had her last pathology results, so they don't need to stick her again, or trying to find out which GP they've been using this month because they're doing a bit of travelling. This is going to be a real lifesaver for them, because it's the people with chronic disease that are seeing multiple providers. This is going to make a huge difference.
I mean, when it first comes out, it's not going to be perfect. It's got to go opt-out later this year. And the reason why Judith had a lot of trouble was that she had to register for it. So that's what we're trying to get to, that you don't have to register for it, but you can just get yourself off it easily if you don't want. Because, yeah.
I mean, and the other thing to remember that you're, because it's linked to Medicare, if you're an organ donor, that'll be up there. All the immunisation records will be up there So they automatically flow over from all the Medicare information as well.
Yeah.
So
I mean, this project is,
it's huge.
Yeah, it's a Snowy River, project. It's huge. The health system's huge, and we're trying to build something huge there. Look.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Yeah, sure.
Advance Care Directives are not necessarily static these days, in that people's situations change. So I'll give you an example. My brother had one, and when he was divorced, his wife was no longer his STM, so he wrote new documents. So the other important thing is to make sure that if you do change your documents, that they get into the system in the most current form, because the risk then is that we, in the health system, are looking at the wrong documents and going to the wrong people. The same thing's happened with my father, that we've changed who is his SDM, and we've had to go back to the hospitals and back to into the health system to say, look, he's got an updated one. Just be aware, I think, because as I was talking about before, the complexity of our lives means that things change. Yeah.
Yes, that's really true. Look, we might now take some questions from the crowd. I think Heather had a question first. Is that right, Heather? Might just give one to Heather first, and then I'll hand some.
My name's Heather Alison. I've just been doing some research in South Australia on what happens when you present an Advance Care Directive to hospitals. So I've just got some questions, please, just that are really practical, maybe for Karen and Christine and yourself, Chris. People appointing a substitute decision maker is not necessarily a family member. It can often it's your friend that you trust or you have a great relationship with, and family dynamics around that are really complicated. So the message is to do it early and consider it early, but I think people should also communicate and talk about that it's not necessarily family that is a substitute decision maker. And my other thing is just a question. In the current Advance Care Directive form, it has a section around what's important to me and what are my values. From what I understand, that's really critical from the health professional's point of view to understand that. One of the practices of lawyers is to cross all of those pages out. So I'm just wondering if you can please comment on that, given that you've got a crowd of a lot of community people here.
I'll deal with the substitute. Oh, sorry.
I'm happy to comment on that.
Okay, yeah, go, Lee.
You can do your own Advance Care Directive. Some people, when they go to a lawyer to get their wills done, they offer to do them. What Heather said is absolutely correct. This has come back to us, that they're often, people have found that the same information has been put into a number of ACDs. So I don't think that they've necessarily taken the time to go through and speak with the person and really find out what it is that's important to them and what they want. So I think really, if you can, do it yourself. If you need some help, there are various places that can help you with that. I think lawyers seem to have a slightly different headset about the process, but what you've said, Heather, is what we've been told as well.
I was going to say on that, I agree with that. The document's about you. It's not a legal document. It is a legal document, but it's not supposed to be a legal document. It's you. Okay. The other thing is that getting back to your first question, absolutely. I do not believe that it has to be a family member. Part of advanced care planning that happens with me is when I have somebody, a family in there, and we're actually determining who's going to be the substitution maker, I'm actually explaining to them their responsibility. They have to be able to make the decision that their loved one wanted. And sometimes they balk at that point, and that's fine. If they are, then they're probably not the right person. So I think that's the thing, not necessarily the one that loves you the most, it's actually the one that is able, that you trust to actually follow through on the decision. That's not being horrible about it, but just some people just can't make those decisions because it's just too hard a decision. Kathy, I'll let...
What happens if it comes to the crunch time and the substitute decision maker actually says, no, actually, I want to ignore what's in the Advance Care Directive, do everything? What if they go against that?
Well, let's go down the... Well, remember the whole principle of the Act. If I'm in the crunch time, the principle of the Act is that you must always do what the patient would have wanted. Now, they probably would have some other wishes there, and I'd be asking them why what they're saying is inconsistent with the wishes, right? I'd be asking them that. And if I'm unhappy about that, I would go to the public advocate. But let me explain to you what I mean about writing stuff that matters to you. If the individual wrote... I'll give you an example. This is one that happens quite often. Somebody has had slow bleeding lesion that's going on for years. They've had enough. They've had enough. They've had their 40th transfusion. They've really had enough, okay? They know they're going to die if they don't have another transfusion. Okay, so they've written on there, no more transfusions, but my family is really important to me. That's that section you wrote about, what is important to me. My family is really important to me. And then they become unconscious, but the substitute maker comes up to me and says, can you please give them one more transfusion? And I'll say, why? And they'll go, it's because their son is flying over from London at the moment to see them one more time. And I'll go, Reed, it's consistent with their wishes. And I'll be comfortable with doing that at that point. Do you see why that order is there? And that's why it works. And that's the reality of it. That's why it's important just as much to write the things that are important to you than the things you don't want done to you. Sorry. Actually, I'll go right there. I think that was the question there. My apologies if we'll work our way through.
My name's Bob. I'm a Justice of the Peace, and I belong to the Royal Association of Justices. And I'm pleased that the president of our association is here as well, because he and I wrote the training program under the old scheme for the Royal Association of Justices members back in 2005. And so we're familiar with the old scheme, and we're very familiar with the new one, and we practice it, and we're pleased with it. But I've come across recently, and I work in the courts as an on-duty justice, and we get many members, or many public people coming along and wanting us to witness their documents. And over the years, I know I've done hundreds of them, and I know my fellow member has done the same, and most of the other justices. What has been brought to my notice recently by some of my old, I'll call them customers, is that when they've been going to admit themselves into hospital, and I'm not talking palliative care or major aspects, they're being asked about Advance Care Directives, and it's great. But what they're telling me, and I've been receiving phone calls about this, the actual clerk, when they have said they've got advance directives, in other words, enduring power of guardianship, medical, etc., that they're no good anymore, you have to have them on the new forms. Now, at this point in time, that's a very dangerous thing, and it's causing untold stress to the patient or the would-be patient, because suddenly they're supposed to be booking into hospital, and now they're being told their legal documents are no good anymore by the admittance clerk. And so they're rushing out, and then they're told, look, it's only $5 to go and buy a new one. Yeah, but it's not the $5, it's the fact that they're being given the wrong information at the floor. And you can't blame, I'm not saying the person is doing it deliberately, they obviously haven't been informed correctly and in writing so they don't make that mistake. Because the majority of the public, they have trouble filling out the form themselves, and they go to solicitors. And the new forms, they're being charged $250, $350, $800 to submit a new form. And this is untold, unnecessary pressure and stress on the public. And I've contacted the Queen Elizabeth 2 weeks ago to talk about the problem, and after 6 different extensions, I was shunted from pillar to post and referred to the RAH.
Could I just stop you there, because this is a problem we...
All I'm saying is, can somebody follow it through to stop this unnecessary direction? And I'm not blaming the clerk trying to book you in. I'm saying it's a policy matter and it should be corrected.
That is policy. That doesn't mean that people read the policy, and that's a problem, and we've got to get them to do it. I mean, the policy is they should know this stuff, okay? I was part of it, and I'm not even working for SA Health, but I can tell you now, as part of it, I've seen the documents. They're supposed to know it, but you know what? Does everybody here read everything? Correct. The problem is we have a fundamental problem, but I'll hand over to Lee there.
If it's particular hospitals, if you want to tell me which hospitals it is, we can follow that up, see if we can. Any apart from the Queen Elizabeth?
The Queen Elizabeth said it should be the RAH that do it because they work across the whole state.
So Chris, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment because we've had the same experience with lawyers as well, but I think they make a point in that if you're a well person and you're writing an Advance Care Directive, put down the things that are important to you, as we saw in the one that was shown. What's important in your life? Please do not put particular medical treatments in your Advance Care Directive because you actually don't know what might happen to you in the future and what's going to be relevant and what isn't. And that's what I've heard lawyers saying and telling not to refuse certain things because you actually don't know what's ahead. If you're a person who already has an advanced illness of a particular kind, you may know something about what's likely to happen to you, and then it might be relevant to put certain things down. No, I don't want dialysis if my kidney function gets even worse, because I expect that's going to happen. You know, that sort of thing, make it relevant to yourself. And that's in answer to your question. We don't know, many of us don't know what's relevant to us yet. We just know what's important to us. Yeah. No.
And I know one day she wanted the lights in, she wanted classical music playing.
Yep.
And that was so important to her.
Exactly.
Nothing about drugs.
No.
That's what she wanted to die in hospital with these two things.
Yep.
I'm actually going to go upstairs because I don't think we've got to be fair to the people upstairs, and there's a question from up there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. This is primarily for Gaynor, I think. You mentioned much earlier, Chris, about people who've got their wishes on 5 different pieces of paper. So my aunt has dementia, she's in a nursing home, she can't make her own decisions now. It's quite clear that my sister and I are her decision makers, we're her guardians, that's been through the public trustees, that's not in question. However, her wishes, there's some of it in her guardianship papers, there's a do not resuscitate form in her purse. There's bits and pieces everywhere. And once upon a time, I used to find that as a guardian, the hospital would just say, what do you think she wants us to do? And I'd say, and it'd be done. And now they say, have you got Section 32 powers? I go, oh, well, not for this, I don't know. So how do we get my aunt's expressed wishes, they're in writing, how do we get them onto her My Health record so that when she goes from the nursing home to the hospital and before we turn up at the hospital, her wishes are known and clear? I don't think that would be a rare situation for older people who are likely to be in this situation.
Yeah, this is a tricky area because I think the first thing is if they're on all these documents, the legal standing is difficult because I don't know what the individuals who wrote it, whether they're signed or witnessed by the individual. A refusal that's signed or witnessed by an individual actually does have legal standing. If you say you don't want something done, it doesn't. But the problem is it's difficult to work out where it stands. The next thing is that I think that the ACD can only be completed by somebody who's a decision-making capacity, so that's your problem at this moment in time. I think the thing to do, the best we've got at the moment, I think, ideally in South Australia, is to try and have a meeting and everybody try to make the decision that the individual would have wanted based on all the bits of paper there and try and transfer it to a 7-step pathway at that point, if possible, if it's a matter of resuscitation and those issues. Because that's your best chance, I think, because that would give clear instructions to those things, because that one doesn't require. Okay, that's a doctor trying to synthesise it into something which is actually going to be useful at the end, but putting in all the things, and everybody should be trying to do what the individual would have wanted.
We leave out the ADC and go from her multiple pieces of paper to a clinical pathways.
Yep.
Because she is elderly and frail and clinical pathways are a reasonable thing to do. And then that goes on her My Health record and that should simplify. That sounds good.
Yep. I might just hand over a question to here. Thank you.
Two quick things. In the absence of any current disease or anything else, what I've done is create a whole lot of threshold questions for my children to ask the clinician.
So they are sort of general but specific, if you like. The other thing I wanted to say was you talked briefly about the purple package for GPs. Can you give us a bit more information about that and how that works?
This is actually a part of the GP shared care program. It's a program to try and get GPs to work with palliative care specialists a little bit better out in the community, because there has been this sort of dichotomy and kind of two services not working together, and we want everybody working as a team. And so one aspect of this was to try and bring the paperwork at the crunch point that's required into one thing, so everybody's got it there. So everybody's got it there who comes and sees the individual, but also particularly in the middle of the night, you can get all those documents in the one spot. It's a bit of it's a signal that this is individuals for palliation. Yeah. Sorry, I'll go there. Thank you.
Thank you.
So sorry, yeah, a lot of hands up at the moment.
In the event that I outlive my offspring, which heaven forbid, where does it revert to?
I might hand over to Lee. So they've got the ACD, you mean?
Well, they will.
They're a substitution maker.
Yes.
So you've outlived them and they're a substitution maker. So what happens then?
Well, if the substitute decision makers aren't available,
Or does it revert to a public?
I mean, what we'd do is look for whatever remaining substitute makers, but we'd also look at whatever wishes you might have written there, because they're still valid. They would still be valid. But in an ideal world, you would then actually probably redo another Advance Care Directive, which would actually supersede that previous one.
Right.
Or
exactly, but all you can do is do the best you can with what you got. Yeah. Because it's too late to do it anyway.
Sorry, if you've got the ACD still, the hospitals will use the person responsible to make decisions about your care, etc. So it won't be your substitute decision makers, it'll be whoever else is left and is closest to you.
But the wishes, on that consent hierarchy, the wishes would still outrank. If the wishes were relevant in a situation, they would outrank the person responsible.
Right.
Because you don't know who they are really. You haven't spent the time to appoint them, so they still outrank them.
Okay,
sorry, could I go? This gentleman there had a question. He had his hand up. Nick, I'll come to you, Alex.
Hi there, Tony Sangstrom, a healthcare consumer. The glitch I see is in assessment of decision-making capacity, because you're asking not only doctors, but lawyers, veterinary surgeons, all sorts of people to sign or say that the person is competent and that they have requisite capacity. 20 years ago, after the death of a family friend in a hospital and the subsequent coroner's inquiry, I sort of and since then done a personal journey at looking at decision-making capacity and how it's assessed. And what I've found is that there is very little or nothing here in Australia. For example, APRA, which is the federal registry body for health professionals, doesn't, and in the medical section particularly, doesn't have any care, sort of want a practice code for how you assess decision-making capacity. As far as I know, and having looked at this as much as I can, and obviously not being quite up to date, there's no undergraduate or comprehensive postgraduate tuition in this. You have the Consent to Treatment and Palliative Care Act back in 1997. It says in there that if there's a dispute or legal dispute, then it goes on what part of that will be on what the profession's particular practice is, and there is nothing there. There's nothing at ACT as well.
Can I just correct you on that? I think the Advance Care Directives Act actually does enshrine decision-making capacity.
I'm not saying that, I'm saying the assessment of it.
No, I get it. And the thing, let me put it to you this way. Okay, I'll give you some, I mean, look, it's not for me to decide decision-making capacity, other people to decide that, but I agree with you, it's a touch point, because first up, people don't understand it, and that's not just people out there, but it's doctors as well. That's the first thing. I actually do think that we override decision-making capacity too quickly. Okay, they've got dementia, they can't decide anything. That's not true. A lot of people with dementia can make decisions. The actual general understanding of decision-making capacity is, I think, actually pretty clear. It's actually, you presume it first, and you've got to prove it can't. So you start from a position they've got decision-making capacity. That's innocent until proven guilty, And then you've got to break down one of those 4 things. And it's relevant to the decision that's in front of you, and it's got to be temporal as well. You've got to take in the fact that it could be fluctuating. That's all you can do. There is actually the New South Wales, there's a New South Wales toolkit, which is about the closest thing we've got. And then after that, you probably have to go to a psychiatrist or a neurologist to maybe do an assessment. But that's all you can do. But the problem is that's impractical in real world. But I do agree that there's a serious issue with that, because I actually do think there's actually an issue of elder abuse out there, where people are actually overriding people's decision-making capacity, like, oh, I've got to sell your home because you haven't got decision-making capacity.
In fact, can I just butt in here? I went to the 4th National Elder Abuse Conference the other day, and I heard this terrible phrase, and it was called inheritance, well, the word for speeding it up, I've lost it now, but it was actually inheritance. No, they were actually accelerated inheritance. They were actually that's what they were trying to do. Inheritance impatience. That's what they said. They said that they are seeing more and more inheritance impatience, which is a dreadful concept, isn't it?
Christine.
Can I go to your comment? Can I reassure you that there is more and more emphasis on this, certainly in the hospital system. I don't know what's happening out in general practice, but I certainly know in the hospital system there's more and more emphasis on ensuring that all clinicians understand the concept. The other thing is it's not a global concept of decision making. It's around one single decision. So every time a nurse goes to do something, they need consent. Every time we do something, even give a tablet, we need to have consent from that person. So what Chris said about assuming that they have consent and needing evidence to show they haven't, a person hasn't, is really important. Now, the dementia case is a very important one, because a person may have very clear decision-making capacity around some things, but around others not. So you go with what you can get and you facilitate it and support it the best you can. So somebody with dementia, for example, we're learning more and more. If we've got a decision that can be made in the morning, not in an emergency, when that person's likely to be at their best, then that's when we need to do it. Not wait till late in the day when that person can no longer do it. It's those sort of concepts. The 4 steps are being reiterated and emphasised a lot.
Well, I do have a quibble with those 4 steps. I think there's one missed out.
What's that?
Okay, this goes on what I've read from American literature, and it's from 2 psychiatrists, Grisot and Applebaum, and what they looked at was schizophrenic patients who, obviously, mental illness, and therefore there's some concerns. And what they pointed out was that yes, they had to be alert, they had to have an understanding, be able to say back to you in their own words what they're supposed to understand. But then they talked about appreciation. What they meant by that was that the person understands that this is about them. They're not in a state where they don't have the insight to understand this is about them. They could perfectly understand that somebody that has these things would need this operation. And from what I can see, there's no emphasis in the English literature. There is in the American, but not in the English literature about that. And we've got to remember that it's not just mental health care patients that need that assessment, it's other people, because mental illness does affect other people.
I must stop you there, because I think what you're saying is, I think I can accept that. But one thing you've got to keep in mind, this has got to be workable 24 hours a day on a ward by people that aren't trained, that have to do it every time they give somebody a tablet. And that's the problem with something like this. And the reason why those 4 things actually do work, because they're actually pretty basic. We have to get away from people thinking that a mini mental test is a test of it. It's rubbish. We have to get away from that sort of stuff and teach people that you have to be able to break down those 4 things in decision-making capacity. And I've already talked to Lee about the fact that there's a legislation that we're looking at, and I think we need to put it in the paperwork that people have to fill out to actually do the test if it's something serious. So I'll hand over to Alex here. Have we got Alex?
Oh, sorry.
I think we're nearly there.
So firstly, thank you to all the panel members, because it's fantastic. And in terms of the personal stories that came through, and Chris, what you were talking about in terms of clinicians having that dilemma when they're faced with these really difficult choices, it seems like good outcomes happen not just when there's an advance care directive, but when the people that are advocating on that person's behalf have quite a high level of health literacy. I guess coming into your example, Chris, of all of the things that happen when a clinician is trying to make these decisions, what does the panel think about the current support for substitute decision makers, and if this is an area that maybe things are falling down in terms of the translation between someone's wishes and their self-determination and what actually happens when we get into hospital.
Any takers on this one? Alison.
Look, I think, my view, and certainly the conversations I've had with my family members, is it's important that they are informed and assertive users of health services. And sometimes that's easier for me. It's easy to work your way through a large system when you know how that system operates. And it's easier to know who to have the conversations with and how to be clear about those things. It's also easy to appreciate the level of concern and anxiety that health practitioners have about making sure that the information they're getting from family members and support people is true and credible and they're doing the right thing. And I think that's often where health practitioners balk at that. One of the things for me was I was the only person at the time visiting my father because the rest of my family found that extremely difficult for different reasons. And I had a conversation initiated by the medical registrar who said, it's always a concern when we only hear from one family member because the reality is they were concerned that there potentially would be different views and problems in the future. So I think it's really important to be really clear about what you want and that everybody has a right as a consumer of health services to ask the hard questions and expect to be informed. And part of what I've sort of talked to my family is, if you were waiting for a Coles checkout and somebody didn't come and open another aisle when there were 5 people, you'd be up in arms and you'd be a really assertive user of the supermarket. You should think of your health services the same way. You have a right and you need to be. I certainly had to be clear and assertive about the role of my father's Advance Care Directive and that it was in place, and I expected them to respect that and that they had a legal obligation to do that. But once we'd had that conversation, there were no qualms about it, but I did have to emphasise it. And I'm unsure whether other members of my family would have been able to do that.
I think you made a really good point, though, that I've got 2 brothers and you're a nurse, and the people that are chosen up here are in that way. I do think you may need a simpler form than the one that's out at the moment, because it would be very off-putting to people that were not highly literate or understanding of all of it. So maybe we do actually need to think about the average Jack and Jill out there who haven't got a high standard of literacy. I mean, they did a survey recently, and I'll use this against Tasmania, but they said that there's something like half the population in Tasmania were functionally illiterate. So I mean, this was because a lot of these forms are putting people off. I mean, so how do you actually have that very high level discussion about life and death issues, fill out a form and get all the people to sit around the table and do it who actually don't have that level of either knowledge or literacy? And I think that is a huge challenge to make it simpler for ordinary people to understand. A bit like the Rupert Murdoch thing. It should be his newspapers were pitched at a 12-year-old or something, apparently, weren't they? Because he wanted people to buy the newspapers and read them. And if you pitch information as if you're a health professional, then people are probably going to steer away from it. That's just a thought.
I would like to just put to you, I mean, I've been sounded almost hard against my colleagues, but I haven't actually. I'm trying to indicate to you that it is actually really difficult being a doctor sometimes. And I think the first thing to say is I don't think it's a matter of actually just consumer literacy. It's actually doctor literacy on these issues as well, and it's actually a big issue. But today we've started. I mean, today what I've said to you is if you appoint a substitute maker, they've got one job, to be that person. That's a pretty simple start. So if you can send that message out there, that's a big start. And that's the way you're supposed to act. Sorry, one more question, I think. So my apologies, I think we've got one there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
My name's Jeremy Moore and I was the President of the Guardianship Board and I was a lawyer for a long time and am a lawyer. And there's a few things that have been said today which are a worry. One, it's really important, those enduring powers of guardianship, they came in 1993 and all the lawyers at that time when they had them, they had these things which were new and they had medical powers of attorney at the same time. We would ask our clients what they wanted. We'd talk about all the things they could put in there and it became apparent that they'd take the forms home and they'd put them in the bottom drawer and it'd go nowhere. And it was out of that that the outcome came about that lawyers would say, look, for God's sake, just pick someone you trust to be your substitute decision maker. We called them guardians in those days. And that way we got a lot of people who have signed up to those forms, and it's sad to hear that in the hospital system, and I don't know who's to blame for it, but you know, something needs to be done instantly, not later. It's got to be done straight away. There are thousands and thousands of those enduring powers of guardianship out there, and they do exactly the same thing. You pick someone to make a decision for you. For God's sake, fix it. Just make it happen. I've signed or created hundreds of them. I've been an enduring guardian, understand the rules, and if we could have those 21 years of all of those enduring guardianship, if they are used, we've got a lot more people in the community who've got someone who can make decisions for them. And thank you very much for listening for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. Sorry, there was one other...
You agree?
Yes, I agree.
Will you do something about it?
Can I just say something? I don't work for SA Health. I do this for free. And I've actually been your advocate for a long time. In fact, we set up the policy on this issue. I would like you to kick the pressure up on this issue. One more question at the back, because that was the question we were trying to get to.
I just want to know, with this Carers Directive, how much information have you got to put in through to Aboriginal legal rights for the literacy advantage of Aboriginal people?
Yep. I might hand that over. What have we done on that side of things? I haven't been involved in any of that, I'm afraid, with Indigenous groups and...
Yeah. There is a specific brochure for Aboriginal people that was essentially designed with Aboriginal people early on, who said that essentially Advance Care Directives should prove very useful in terms of, after a person's death, sorting out who would have responsibility and what different people would do. Apart from the specific brochure, which reiterates the information that's in the other brochure, there isn't any Indigenous specific forms or anything like that.
I do know, by the way, that Palliative Care Australia is doing a project at the moment which is looking at specifically rural and remote areas to do with Aboriginal people, and I know that they're designing a process at the moment through Flying Doctor Service at Port Augusta and other locations around Australia, specifically around some of the particular issues involved in Aboriginal health and advanced care directives. And they're doing a pilot study at the moment where when people come in, they're going to spend time talking to the family members about what will actually happen. So I could provide you with some more information about that, but in terms of what's happening in Adelaide itself, I'm not sure.
And I was aware there was a paper about this somewhere, and it was incorporated into, I think, a document about palliative care. Look, again, I don't work for SA Health, so I see these documents sometimes, people send them to me. But I saw this document, so I think there was some discussion about it. But look, it's a serious issue. It's an important issue because the issues there in terms of who's going to make the decisions and the things that happen are obviously very different from a cultural point of view. And
but the level of high information in regarding Aboriginal interpreters to set up some sort of carers directive to come down the same levels up here, CEOs, well, they don't bring out the information to let the people know in the community itself.
Yep. Thank you for bringing that topic up, because I do agree with you. I think it's a serious issue.
Relevant to us, because 98% of our Aboriginal kids and people are incarcerated. and we can't put these sort of information in because we've got nowhere to go, and even though we've got an Aboriginal service that should provide and care for us. And this is the main issue.
Thank you. I've heard enough of my own voice and probably, not probably these people, but my own voice. So I might hand over to Kathy now. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Kathy Mick and I'm the Manager of Consumer Engagement at HCA, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers and panellists tonight for their words of wisdom and information and encouragement for us to take action. I think the presentations were all really informative and also challenging and inspiring, so thank you for that. And thanks also to Judy for hosting the speakers and for Chris for hosting the panel. And I'd also like to thank the members of our team of HCA staff. I think everybody on our team has put input into making today happen, so thank you for that, for your time and for your professionalism. I'd also like to thank our partners, Adelaide Primary Health Network and SA Health, for sponsoring this event. Without you, it would have been very difficult for us as a small organisation to put this on, so thanks for that. You will find that there are evaluation forms on your chair. They should take you about 1 minute maybe to complete. We like to do things well at HCA, so the only way we're going to know whether we're doing it well is if you give us feedback, and that also helps us to do better next time. Ellie and Ellen are standing down the back, and they will take your evaluation forms as you leave the door. Yeah, that's it. That's your exit pass. A copy of a report will be made on today's event, and we'll include the presentations. So they will be circulated to everybody who has registered for today's event. The video we will have edited. It may take us a number of weeks to make that happen, but once we have got that happening, we will make it available on our website for people to access, and we will promote that in our e-news so that everybody knows that that's available. And finally, I'd like to thank our speakers and panellists again for providing us with some really great foundations for the discussions and conversations that we'll need to have in our own lives and the action that we need to take. I think that includes conversations that maybe we can have with our GP about my health record, as well as about Advance Care Directives. And yeah, I think the discussions can be challenging, and not everybody's going to get on board up front, but I think that we can continue to have those conversations. I know that I've had them in my family, and my parents aren't ready to go there yet, and one of them's already 80, so I've got a bit of a battle on my hands with getting him to understand the importance of it. But I think if we focus on the fact that Advance Care Directives are a matter of love and rights and self-determination, then that's what's going to bring people around. So thanks for your time, and enjoy the rest of your evening.